Zags are only 2 games into the season, so you probably think it's too early to be looking ahead to the 25-26 season, but Mark Few doesn't.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, the Zags are number 4 in the AP poll, up 2 spots from their preseason ranking. We're going to talk about if that's the right spot for them. Also talk about some of their future opponents and where they are slotted into the rankings. Plus, we got a pair of mailbag questions, both regarding conference realignment to talk about closing out the show. But we're leading with a surprise news, or rumor, I should say, that we got from John Rothstein of CBS Sports during the game, or I think right before the game on Sunday, that Virginia transfer guard Jalen Warley is set to visit Gonzaga. Now, I'll explain a little bit about the situation with Warley, but per John Rothstein, Warley has set visits with Gonzaga, Iowa State, and Texas A&M. Warley is currently in the transfer portal, and it is unclear at this point if those 3 schools that he is visiting are an exhaustive list, as in he's not going to pursue other potential places to play. If he is going to look at other places, it's also not clear when these visits are going to happen. Here's the situation with Jalen Warley. Warley is a 6'6" guard. He transferred to Virginia this offseason after spending the first 3 years of his college basketball career at another ACC school in Florida State. So he spent 3 years at Florida State, transferred to Virginia, and then, as many of us recall, 20 days before the season started, Tony Bennett surprised everybody with the announcement that he is retiring effective immediately and will no longer coach the Virginia program. One of his lead assistant coaches is taking over the program. It felt like it was kind of a tailored decision, timing-wise, by Tony Bennett to retire at a time when players would have a more difficult time transferring and playing right away, therefore keeping the roster that he helped build in line. There's a lot of conversation and discourse around this decision. I can understand why Bennett wanted to do right by Virginia, and he felt making the decision or making the announcement of his retirement earlier would have potentially caused a mass exodus, like we saw at West Virginia with Bob Huggins. Granted, that was not a retirement, but it really derailed that program, and he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to do that to his friend who's taken over the program, but at the same time, the players who committed to Virginia to play for Tony Bennett and then find out right before the season starts that he's not going to be their coach, that's not a great situation for them either. Only one player on that Virginia roster decided to opt into the transfer portal. Anytime a coach is fired or retires or leaves their position, there is a 30-day window to enter the transfer portal. Jalen Warley was the only player who chose to enter the transfer portal, doing so about 2 weeks before the start of the season. His intention, what was revealed at the time at least, is to sit out the entire 24-25 season, which will take a red shirt, and then play his senior season in 25-26. So Jalen Warley visiting Gonzaga and Iowa State and Texas A&M is done with the intention of bringing him on board to be part of next year's roster. That is a key part of this conversation. He's not a mid-season addition. Gonzaga is not in a position right now where they need to be looking at mid-season additions. Last year, yes. This year, no. This would be an addition for Gonzaga to bring in a player on the 2025-26 roster. Let's talk about said player, Jalen Warley. 6'6" guard, again, spent the first 3 seasons of his career at Florida State. He's a lengthy, disruptive defensive type who plays the point guard-ish, or played point guard for them, but can play the 2 or the 3. Again, at 6'6", with the amount of length that he has, he's pretty versatile defensively. And I think that's the key. Jalen Warley is not an offensive player. In his junior season at Florida State, the best year of his career, he averaged 7.5 points, 2.8 assists, 2.6 rebounds, and 1.3 steals per game. He's about 1.2 or 1.3 steals all 3 seasons that he was at Florida State. Last year, he shot 43.5% on 2-pointers. That was just under 6 attempts per game. And he shot 14% from 3. And before we panic about that, he was 1 of 7. 1 of 7. Warley played 33 games for Florida State last year and played 24 minutes per game, started 32 games, started all but 1 game for Florida State, played 24 minutes per game, and took 7 3-pointers. He is not a floor spacer. He is not an outside shooter. He's not a scorer. 2.8 assists indicates that he can distribute the basketball, and that was with a very solid assist to turnover ratio. So after 3 years of playing at Florida State, what we have seen from Jalen Warley is a player who can handle the basketball, doesn't cough it up, but doesn't take a lot of shots, doesn't do a whole lot offensively, but he is a very, very good, versatile defensive player. And looking at the fit for him at Gonzaga in 25-26, it's fairly clear to see why Mark Few and the staff would be constantly having their ears to the grindstone about what they can do to improve that roster. Because barring a injury that causes one of these players to miss the rest of the year, this is the final season of college basketball for Ryan Nembhard, for Nolan Hickman, for Caleb Battle, for Mike Ajayi, for Ben Gregg. All of those guys are done at the end of this season, guaranteed, again, barring an injury. It is unclear if either Steele Venters or Graham Ike will return after this season as well. Both do have eligibility. The expectation is that Ike will not, but whether he does or not doesn't really impact Jalen Warley as they play a different position. For Venters, it obviously depends on how he recovers from this injury. If he is able to make a full recovery, if he then chooses to still stay at Gonzaga to end his college basketball career and look to play professionally, to end his basketball career because he doesn't want to continue play or is unable medically to continue to play. There's a lot of different things that could happen with Steele Venters. Obviously, the staff does not have any indication because he is very early in his recovery from yet another knee injury. But right now, the 25-26 roster in the backcourt has Braden Smith, the transfer from Colgate, who is redshirting for Gonzaga this year, Dusty Stromer entering his junior season, Emmanuel Innocente entering his junior season, and Davis Fogel entering his freshman year. Again, Venters could be in the mix. So that is at 6'7", he is somebody who would potentially contend with Warley for playing time, but we can't really count on that right now. So Warley would be the oldest player on the roster. He'd be the senior. He'd be the veteran. He has a ton of high major experience from 3 years at Florida State. He'll have spent this year at Virginia, although not really on the roster, redshirting, but not participating in games or anything like that. I'm not sure if he'll be in practices or anything like that. My guess is no, but I don't know exactly how that works for him at this point. Jalen Warley would make this team instantly better on defense. He is somewhat similar to Stromer and Innocente in the sense that he is a 6'5" or 6'6" wing who can defend multiple positions, who is kind of known more for his defense than his offense. So I can understand thinking like, well, we already have 2 guys who are kind of like that. But Gonzaga's has had struggles defensively. I am A-okay with Mark Few looking to add defensive veteran players to the roster all the time. I am always okay with that. We saw Gonzaga not look particularly good defensively against Arizona State. They looked great against Baylor. I don't think one subpar defensive performance in the second game of the season is necessarily super alarming, but we have years worth of data that says Gonzaga's perimeter defense has been an issue. And Jalen Warley, that's what he does. That's what he brings. Him and Innocente make this team really good on the defensive perimeter. I think it's a great player to reach out to, a great player to contact. The fact that he is interested, I suspect he wants to open up his offensive profile a little bit. Going from a team like Florida State to Virginia, then to Gonzaga is a pretty clear change in the type of strategy that he is looking for. Iowa State is a little bit more like Virginia and Florida State, and Texas A&M is a little bit more in the middle. They shoot a ton of threes. It feels like sort of an odd fit for Warley at Texas A&M, a team that likes to bomb threes, although they are very ineffective at bombing threes. So maybe that's where the fit comes in there with Warley. But Gonzaga is a clear sign that he might be looking for something very different in his senior season. And what he would bring to this team would be significant in terms of veteran experience, size, length in the guard positions, defensive ability, lack of turnovers. Like, there's a lot of really positives here. So this is a story we'll keep an eye on. Again, we don't know when he's visiting. We don't know when he would make a commitment. There's a lot of different parts of this story that are still kind of unclear at this point. But he's a player that if Gonzaga were to land him for 25-26 would help shore up a roster that's going to have a lot of holes to fill and would get it done early in the offseason, or not even in the offseason, early in the previous season, which is even more fun and just puts a little bit less stress on the coaching staff heading into next offseason. Well, folks, Gonzaga moved up 2 spots from number 6 to number 4 in the AP poll. Is that too low? Is that too high? We're going to break it down, all coming up here in just a second. All right, Zag fans, listen up. You need to download the Roy app. You've heard us talk about Roy this season and how they are revolutionizing the NIL industry. Roy allows you, the fan, to have a say in who gets the NIL money. And here's what I absolutely love about Roy. You get your money back if that player transfers. So Roy is helping us keep our team intact, and it's good for the game long term. You can show your support by depositing a little appreciation onto that player's account. To do that, download the Roy app. You can see what the logo looks like if you're watching on YouTube, or just go to joinroy.com. Now let's spotlight the Roy/Locked On Player of the Week. For us, it's Braden Huff. 21 points off the bench for Gonzaga in Sunday's win over Arizona State. To show our appreciation, we're going to throw a little bit of money into his account on Roy. Every contribution counts. $10, $20, it all adds up, and it's going to help keep your favorite players here in Spokane. So join me now and show some love for Braden by downloading the Roy app or going to joinroy.com today. Use promo code Locked On, and every athlete from every team is there. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Go to joinroy.com for full terms. Roy, support the players, change the game. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Moving away from talking about the surprise news that Gonzaga is potentially going to host Jalen Warley, Virginia transfer guard, in the next couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months. We're not sure when it's going to happen, but that is the report we saw from John Rothstein. But now I want to talk about the AP poll. Probably going to talk about this every Tuesday. I think it's going to be a big storyline this season. Where is Gonzaga ranked, especially when you look at their schedule and the teams that they're playing? Where is UConn ranked? Where is Arizona ranked? Where is UCLA? Where is UCLA? We'll talk about that. Where's Kentucky, et cetera, et cetera. For Gonzaga, after Monday night, I think most people expected that Gonzaga would not only move up from number 6, which is where they were in the preseason, but that they had a realistic chance of being number 1. That ultimately did not happen. Gonzaga did not look nearly as strong against Arizona State. We're not panicking about that. It was still a quality win against a team that's probably a little better than people expected them to be. But ultimately, Gonzaga does move up 2 spots. They go from number 6 to number 4 in the AP poll. Ahead of them are Kansas, who remains at number 1 after beating North Carolina at the Fog. Alabama at number 2. I moved them down in my personal rankings because they did not look good against Arkansas State, but AP voters tend to not move teams down unless they actually lose, so they stay at number 2. UConn stays at number 3. So you got Kansas, Alabama, UConn, Gonzaga at 4. The rest of your top 10 is Auburn, who probably should have moved up even farther. Duke at 6, Iowa State at 7, Houston at 8, who lost to that Alabama team, Arizona at 9, and then North Carolina, who lost to Kansas by 3, rounding out the top 10. I think Gonzaga at 4 feels about right. In my personal rankings, which are released as part of the Locked On College Basketball Composite Rankings every week, I also post them on USA Today for College Sports Wire, so you can find them on social media. You can go to collegesportswire.com, find the article there as well. I had Gonzaga at 4. I hemmed and hawed between having them at 3 or 4, ultimately ended up having them at 4. I did not have the same 3 teams in front of them. I did have Kansas number 1, but I had Duke number 2, and then I had Auburn at number 3 with Gonzaga at 4 right behind them. So I had them at number 4. The AP had them at number 4. Ken Pom has them at number 4. They are the number 1 adjusted offense right now in college basketball. They are 48th in defensive efficiency. They started at 45th. Then they moved all the way up to 25th after that game against Baylor. Then they dropped all the way down to 48th after the game against Arizona State. The main lesson here, early season, you're just going to see a lot of movement. You're going to see a lot of movement. If Gonzaga's defense starts to look more like it did against Baylor, they're going to move up. If they give up 85 points to Long Beach State or UMass Lowell or Bucknell, they're going to move down. That's not exactly rocket science, but that's just, especially early in the season when there's not as many data points to go off of, you're going to see some variation and some fluctuation there. But ultimately, Ken Pom has Gonzaga as the 4th best team in the country. So does the AP poll. So does myself. So I feel like we're in a we're kind of all around the same spot there, just inside the top 5. I think we saw what this team looks like when they're at their best. Nobody can beat them. If you beat a Baylor team that's still in the top 25, they actually are only 12th. Then they dropped 4 spots. If you can beat a top 15 team by 38 points at your best, you can beat everybody in the country. This Gonzaga team, they play like that. They absolutely can beat Kansas and UConn and Alabama and Auburn and Houston and Duke and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we also saw a team that, had they played a team better than Arizona State, probably would have lost. That was a game that they were tied or down for large chunks of the second half. Again, not overly concerned. I think the game showed us that Gonzaga's depth is so much better this year than it was last year, but you still don't like to see them come out a little lackadaisical, a little sloppy the way that they did in that one. But this team has some highs and has some lows, and they've already kind of accomplished that in the first two games of the season. So I think early season AP voters tend to be less reactionary than they should. I'm more willing to dramatically change my rankings after a week. And some people say, it's only a week, but preseason rankings feel like they are more difficult than ever before to make. Like Kentucky's a good example. Kentucky was in the top 25 this year. So was Arkansas. And it's like, they're not a single player who was on Kentucky's roster last year. Not a single player. The coaching staff's gone. The players are gone. It's a completely new roster. Sure, we can look at how these players did last year at their respective schools and kind of make a guess as to how good they're probably going to be. But in eras past, that's not how preseason rankings went. So to me, seeing the AP be slow to change things, it's like, if you see a team that didn't look very good in their first game, like I'm willing to move them down a little farther. If they rebound and play well, sure, you move them back up. I think that's just like a general feeling I have about the voting right now, where it's like clinging too hard to preseason projections in an era where rosters are dramatically different just doesn't feel like the right move. So I thought Auburn should have moved a little higher. I thought Bama should have dropped a little bit more, but it's nothing too particularly egregious in these rankings in my mind. So again, Gonzaga's at number 4. Looking at their other opponents that they're going to play this season, UConn is at number 3. Gonzaga, of course, taking on UConn at the Madison Square Garden on the 14th of December. UConn's 2-0 on the year, but they haven't played anybody good. So we'll kind of wait and see what they look like when they get a more marquee opponent. Arizona's at number 9. Gonzaga, of course, could face them in the championship of the Battle for Atlantis, assuming Gonzaga gets by West Virginia and then either Indiana or Louisville, and assuming Arizona advances past the teams that they are playing in that tournament. I can't remember who they're opening against, but then they'll play either Oklahoma or Providence in the second round. So Arizona's got a nice path to championship. Gonzaga has a nice path as well, though Indiana, one of the teams Gonzaga could face in that second game, is 16th in the poll. So a team that Gonzaga could end up facing. They've looked very good. They have played one of the weakest schedules in college basketball. I think Ken Pom has their strength of schedule after 2 games at 343rd. So not taking their results with too much of a grain, or not taking them too seriously, but Umar Ballo has been a good addition for them. I think Miles Rice and Kenan Carlisle will end up better than they've been in the first 2 games. The main story for Indiana is Mackenzie Mbako, their star sophomore. Many thought he'd be a one-and-done candidate. He was a mixed bag as a freshman, but he has been electric in his first 2 games, and I think he could be a huge player for them, and frankly, a massive mismatch for Gonzaga if they end up facing that Indiana team. Baylor dropped from 8 to 12 after the loss because they rebounded and beat an Arkansas team that remains in the polls, just barely hung on to a spot in the top 25. Outside of that, Kentucky is 19th. Gonzaga will, of course, face them at the Climate Pledge Arena on December 7th. They're up 4 spots from 23rd, 2-0 to start the season, scored 100-plus points against Wright State in the opener, and then 100 points against future Gonzaga opponent Bucknell. This Kentucky team is going to score a whole bunch of points. Mark Pope's a very good coach. They're going to be a dangerous team for Gonzaga and potentially a nice win for the Zags if they can pick that one up in Seattle at Climate Pledge Arena. Arizona State also picked up 2 votes despite losing a game already. They obviously lost to Gonzaga. They did beat Santa Clara. They did beat Idaho State. So 2-1 on the year. The Idaho State game was pretty ugly. I think it was like a 7-point win over a not very good team. A little surprised to see Arizona State pick up votes for that, but whoever voted for them must think very highly of Gonzaga and their performance in that game. There were no votes for UCLA, who lost a pretty ugly game already this season to New Mexico, who did in fact get votes. New Mexico got 15 votes, but UCLA did not look good. So they are out of the polls for right now. San Diego State not picking up votes. Neither is San Francisco or St. Mary's or West Virginia or Louisville or any of the other teams Gonzaga is or could potentially play this season. A few other teams of note: Wake Forest, Hunter Salas's team, 84 votes. That's good for 28th. They picked up a nice win over Michigan in the non-conference. BYU got 26 votes. That's good for 30th. In the country. New Mexico got 15, like we said. Oregon, after their move to the Big Ten, they got 14 votes. Grand Canyon, a future Mountain West team, not a future WCC team. Grand Canyon, the Lopes, got 6 votes as well. Well, speaking of conference realignment, speaking of Grand Canyon, we're going to talk about Gonzaga. Could they be a part of Pac-12 After Dark on ESPN? We haven't got that media rights deal, but there's some rumors floating around. We'll talk about that and some more about Grand Canyon's move to the Mountain West, all coming up in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers who bet $5 will get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything that you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch right now in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place those bets. And look, I'm still feeling real good about Gonzaga's chances of winning the battle for Atlantis. Right now, FanDuel has them at plus 135 odds to win that championship. If you like those odds, if you like any of the other odds, they'll have odds very soon for the UMass Lowell game, the San Diego State game. Of course, they continue to have future odds for the championship, the Final Four, etc., etc. Then visit FanDuel.com and join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Once again, that's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're closing out the show with a pair of mailbag questions from Jeff via Gmail. Probably not going to do mailbag as consistently during the season, at least not in the non-conference. If you've noticed, looking at the schedule, Gonzaga's got a lot of either Monday games or Friday games. Of course, they have a lot of weekend games. So we're going to spend a lot of Monday shows recapping games or even previewing games that evening. So we might do some mailbag Tuesday type shows. It doesn't flow as well, but I'll probably record them on Monday. So maybe we'll still call them Mailbag Monday, but still going to try to get to a few questions here and there when we can. So again, these two questions both come from Jeff. First one here says, there were some reports leaking out last week saying the Pac-12 media rights deal is nearing completion. It could be released before Thanksgiving. Have you heard anything about this? If the Pac-12 After Dark returns, what do you think about frequently seeing Gonzaga play games that could regularly go until past 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. at night? So I'll take the first part here. I have not heard anything. I'll believe it when I see it. I understand why the Pac-12 would want to get a media deal done before the Mountain West, as they're both competing for media deals right now. And the Pac-12 wants to be able to take some of those potential opportunities away from the Mountain West and make sure that they're not limiting themselves. If the Mountain West lands a deal first, that organization or organizations that are working with them may not be as willing to work with the Pac-12, et cetera, et cetera. But I also have a hard time imagining the Pac-12 wants to rush into a media deal without knowing the full scope of the teams that are going to be in the conference. And perhaps more importantly, I don't think ESPN or Fox Sports or the CW or whoever is in these conversations really wants to negotiate with the conference, not knowing whether their next editions are going to be Memphis or Sacramento State. So to me, I'm not necessarily as optimistic that there's going to be a deal announced very soon. But hey, maybe there will be. Who knows? In terms of the possibility of Gonzaga being part of Pac-12 After Dark and having late start times on ESPN at like 8 or even 9 p.m. Pacific time, as a podcaster who would probably be up till 2 in the morning on those days with a small child who would be a toddler at that time, perhaps a second child, who knows, that's not great. I mean, personally, for me, that I would not love those late starts. I know many people listening to the show. Shout out those of you in New York. Shout out those of you on the East Coast. Shout out those of you overseas. I see you. I know that you're listening. I appreciate all of you who are there. You're probably not thrilled about the idea of Gonzaga games starting at potentially midnight or 11 p.m. Eastern time. That's not great. I understand why the Pac-12 wants it, and I'm not mad at them for it. I get it. If the Pac-12 can get a deal with ESPN, and part of the deal is that ESPN is going to use late night programming to show Gonzaga basketball games, they're going to do it. And that's good for Gonzaga. They're going to make $10+ million from this deal, potentially, quite likely. And so if the university is making a bunch more money because they're on ESPN at late night games, if ESPN is happy about it, it's just the way that it is. We're going to be up late. We're going to be drinking some extra coffee. We're going to be sleeping in. It's just going to be a new reality for Gonzaga fans. It's going to be unfortunate for a subset of the group, but ultimately, it's part of the price you pay for progress, I suppose. So if that's what happens, that's what happens. Pac-12 After Dark has always kind of been a fun branded thing, and it would be kind of cool for Gonzaga to be a part of it, even if some parts of that wouldn't necessarily be great for yours truly, and for many of the rest of you out there listening to the show. Final question of the show. In the announcement moving to the Mountain West, Grand Canyon made a lot about being one of 3 schools without football who will be competing in conferences that sponsor football, with the other 2 being Gonzaga and Wichita State. When you consider Gonzaga, Grand Canyon, and Wichita State and the competition they face within their respective conferences, which one of those 3 is best situated to be successful? It's Gonzaga. It's Gonzaga, and it's pretty clearly Gonzaga. They're in a better spot. They're in a better conference. They have better opponents around them, but they're also still the best of the group of teams that are in their respective conference. That is not true for Wichita State. It is not true for Grand Canyon. So Gonzaga is heads and shoulders above those 2 programs, and that's with no disrespect to Grand Canyon. I'm not trying to disrespect Wichita State either, but Grand Canyon's closer right now to Gonzaga. But the Mountain West is not as good as the Pac-12 in men's basketball, and Gonzaga is still the better competitor in their conference than Grand Canyon is in theirs. I'll start with Wichita State. They're not in a great situation. They're a distant third on this group. They should not be in the American Athletic Conference. They shouldn't have left the Missouri Valley Conference to go to the American. I'm sure they made more money, and I'm sure it made sense at the time, but it has not worked out for them. They do not compete for titles in the AAC. They're not likely to suddenly compete for titles if Memphis leaves. And if that conference does fall apart, which doesn't look super likely, but maybe Memphis and Tulane and South Florida and things start falling apart, even still, I'm not sure Wichita State's a great fit in that league. They're a better fit in the Missouri Valley Conference if they wanted to tuck their tails and go back. They're a better fit in the A-10 if they wanted to go there, if the A-10 wanted to invite them. That's the conference with Dayton and St. Louis and VCU and some other prominent men's basketball programs. I could see Wichita State trying to knock on the door of the Mountain West potentially to say, hey, let us in. If you're going to let Grand Canyon in, let us in. We're a strong basketball brand too. But they're the worst of these 3 schools from a men's basketball perspective, and they're in the worst conference, and they're the farthest from competing. Grand Canyon has New Mexico, Nevada, and UNLV as legit year in, year out NCAA tournament competition. UNLV has only recently been in that conversation. They've had some ups and downs throughout the last couple of decades. They obviously were very good about 30 years ago with grandmama Larry Johnson, but they haven't been a particularly great men's basketball program outside of that, but they're a high resource school in a prominent area. New Mexico and Nevada are both fairly consistently in the NCAA tournament. I think New Mexico is a really strong program right now, but I don't know that Grand Canyon's definitively better than those teams. I see the Mountain West as being a 2 to 3 bid league as it's currently constructed. 3 would be a pretty good year. 2 feels a bit more likely because they're not going to have those opportunities to beat up on San Diego State and Boise State and Colorado State and those other teams where if you picked up a few of those wins, it made your resume look a little bit better. It boosted your net ranking. You don't have those anymore. So to me, Grand Canyon's probably first, maybe second or third best team in that conference going forward, assuming they can continue the momentum they have right now under Bryce Drew. And it's a 2 or 3 bid league. So Grand Canyon's in a decent spot. I think they're going to consistently make the NCAA tournament in the Mountain West. But Gonzaga's in a better spot. Gonzaga is right now better than San Diego State, than Boise State, than Colorado State, than Utah State. But all those teams are legitimate NCAA tournament competitors. I look at this Pac-12 as it's currently constructed and with knowing that those schools are going to have a little bit of boost financially and things of that nature. And I see a conference that's probably a 4 bid league, 5 bid league potentially. Not every year necessarily. Some bad years, maybe it's 3, some good years, maybe it's 5 or 6. But it's going to, I think consistently, the Pac-12 will put more teams in the NCAA tournament than the Mountain West. And I think Gonzaga is more likely year in and year out to be favored in the Pac-12 than Grand Canyon is in the Mountain West. So Gonzaga's in the best position. Grand Canyon's behind them in the second best position. Wichita State need to figure something else out because things are not looking good for the Shockers in the American Athletic Conference at this current point. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Be back later this week. We'll continue to keep you up to date on everything going on around college basketball. We'll talk some Zags in the NBA. An unfortunate update on Chet Holmgren. Talk some WCC basketball. Of course, at the end of the week, get you ready for that Friday night game against UMass Lowell. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.